In the polished halls of Victorian England, a quiet servant meticulously cleans the floors, invisible and unnoticed, until, with a few whispered words of fluent Japanese, she captures the attention of an astonished prince and unsettles the delicate balance of diplomacy. Drawn irresistibly into a hidden world of secrets, heritage, and unexpected identity, the prince finds his understanding of duty and desire shaken to the core. Together, against all social conventions and political constraints, they must navigate the fragile line between truth and power, discovering in each other the courage to be seen for who they truly are. The hall at Locksley House shimmered with lamplight and laughter, its tall arched windows fogged by the breath of 100 bodies. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden haze over embroidered gowns and high-collared coats, and the air trembled faintly with the murmur of diplomacy, measured, careful, and endlessly rehearsed. Outside, a chill March wind swept across the lawns and howled faintly through the hedges, but within the estate's grand walls, the evening pressed forward in measured, stately elegance. Hannah moved silently near the edge of the room, a linen cloth folded in her hand, her knees just grazing the polished floor as she buffed the hardwood with quiet precision. She was dressed in the plain uniform of a housemaid, a gray muslin dress, long sleeves buttoned tight at her wrists, and a white apron that bore the slight sheen of starch. Her black hair was pinned in a tight coil at the base of her neck. She kept her eyes low, gaze fixed on the glinting surface beneath her. It wasn't her place to look up, and in a room like this, filled with nobles and diplomats and men who had signed treaties, servants did best when they became invisible. The sounds around her passed like distant waves, the clink of glass against glass, the murmur of a waltz drifting from the adjoining music room, the soft flutter of a silk fan as it opened and closed. The scent of beeswax polish clung to her hands, faintly layered over with the sharper perfume of the foreign incense burned discreetly by the entrance. She knew this rhythm well, the carefully staged elegance of a gathering where everything was supposed to appear effortless and nothing ever truly was. She shifted, smoothing her hand along the edge of the polished baseboard, and caught a glimpse of the gold-fringed hem of a lady's gown as it passed. Her shoulders remained relaxed, her face impassive. She knew every creak of this room, every flaw in the molding. She'd cleaned it with bare hands before anyone arrived, long before the fireplaces had been stoked and the wine uncorked. Now, hours later, her task continued quietly beneath the feet of England's most powerful men. Tonight's gathering, she'd overheard, was not merely a ball. It was a diplomatic reception, an event to mark the arrival of a foreign delegation from the distant East, Japan, newly opened to English eyes and politics, and the subject of quiet fascination in every parlor and club across London. The Japanese envoy had arrived just before dusk, a small group of men in formal Western coats, their movements precise, their manner reserved. She had seen them only briefly when the steward had rushed her from the hallway. Now they were here, standing near the center of the room in a ring of curiosity. Their translator stood nearby, murmuring clumsy English in response to polite questions from curious guests. The language fell awkwardly from his tongue, and many of the lords and ladies listening smiled with polite incomprehension. Others only nodded, too wary of causing offense. Hannah worked steadily, her attention never drifting for long, though she couldn't help but listen.
She understood the words spoken by the ambassador, the true words, not the hesitant English being passed along. The nuances were delicate, the meaning carefully shaped. The translator's version was incomplete, sometimes even incorrect. No one else seemed to notice. She slid a few inches to the left, still on her knees, still wiping in slow circles. Her cloth moved silently across the floor's smooth grain.
She was no longer close enough to catch every word, but she recognized the rhythm, the cadence of formality, and the way it softened when the ambassador addressed one of the younger envoys. It reminded her of her earliest memories, half-formed images of a place where the trees were heavy with white blossoms and the language had filled every corner of the house like music. A burst of laughter drew her attention across the room. Prince Edward of Corwin, tall and clean-shaven, stood near a cluster of foreign dignitaries and English peers. He wore the dark blue of court dress, his collar stiff with embroidery, a gold watch chain glinting against his waistcoat. His posture was perfect, almost too perfect, as though it had been carved from stone rather than cultivated over years. His expression was composed, but not disinterested. He watched everything, even while he appeared to be engaging in effortless conversation. She had noticed that about him before. He rarely repeated himself, rarely asked questions unless he already knew the answer. It was said he had no equal in matters of discretion and control, that he could drink with dukes and duel with ministers in Parliament, that he had been chosen by the Queen herself to represent the Crown tonight, as a gesture of seriousness and esteem. He had not noticed her yet. Of course he hadn't. He had no reason to. She shifted back, just slightly, pressing her hand into the cloth to buff out a faint scuff mark near the baseboard. Her fingers were stiff with cold. The gloves she wore in the kitchen had long since been removed, and her skin had grown pink with exposure. But she continued, careful, steady. The longer she could remain unseen, the safer she was, the calmer. From the corner of her eye, she noticed the Japanese ambassador turn away from the group of gentlemen and glance briefly around the room. His gaze passed over several ladies, the musicians near the door, and then lowered, just slightly, to the edge of the floor where Hannah knelt. Their eyes met. It was only a moment, a fleeting beat in the vast machine of the evening. But something in the ambassador's gaze stilled her. Recognition, perhaps, or curiosity. She dipped her head instinctively and resumed her work, hoping the moment would pass unnoticed. But he stepped forward. The quiet shuffle of shoes across polished wood brought him nearer. A few heads turned in mild confusion. He passed a footman without pause and came to stand just a few feet from where she knelt. For a breathless moment, Hannah felt the air leave her body. She tightened her grip on the cloth and lowered her eyes again. Then, with a soft voice, he spoke to her in Japanese. It was a simple greeting, formal, courteous, the kind one might offer to an acquaintance met unexpectedly in the street, the kind that expected a response. The silence in the room changed. It was not loud, but perceptible, a hush around the edges, a flicker in the rhythm, as though something small had snapped and the music, the voices, the wine pouring, all held still. Hannah responded, not loudly, not timidly either. Her answer was precise, her accent perfect, her words shaped by years of silence and memory. She did not look up as she spoke. She did not rise. But the moment the first word left her lips, she felt the shift around her. Dozens of eyes turned. The ambassador replied, a note of warmth entering his tone. And then, to the astonishment of the onlookers, he bent slightly at the waist, a gesture of respect, quiet and unmistakable. Hannah remained perfectly still, and from across the room, Prince Edward of Corwin stared at her as though he'd never seen a maid before in his life. For the first time that evening, his composure cracked. He stepped forward once, as though unsure. Then again, this time with purpose, the crowd parting around him in confusion. His gaze never left her. He passed lords, diplomats, and stewards, as if they were made of smoke. His polished boots struck the floor with measured force. Hannah rose slowly, cloth still in hand. She could feel the heat rising in her face. The weight of 100 gazes pinned her in place. The prince stopped in front of her. And then, in a voice that carried through the room like the sudden toll of a bell, he asked her name. A hush settled over the room like a drawn curtain, rippling outward from where Prince Edward stood before the maid, his question hanging in the air. "What is your name?" he had asked, not with the detached condescension of a noble addressing a servant, but with startled gravity, as if he were speaking to someone whose answer might matter more than anyone else in the room. Hannah stood motionless, her fingers still wrapped around the edge of her cleaning cloth, the scent of beeswax and pine oil lingering on her skin. She felt as if a light had been cast on her in a dark theater, exposed, displayed, and entirely unprepared for what followed. The slight bend of the ambassador's bow still echoed in the air like a struck chord. It had been a bow not of greeting, but of deference. She kept her eyes low. "Hana," she said quietly. Just Hana. No surname, no explanation. The prince did not move. He looked at her as though trying to unearth something beneath her skin, some mask or trick that might reveal the truth of what he had just witnessed. His brows drew slightly together, not in confusion, but in calculation. Every inch of him radiated controlled disbelief. He had watched her moments ago, crouched at the base of a column, indistinguishable from the rest of the staff, wiping polish into floorboards. Now she stood beneath the attention of two nations. "Where did you learn Japanese?" he asked, lower this time, though still loud enough to draw murmurs from those nearest. Hana hesitated. She felt the burn of every glance that circled the salon, the charged atmosphere broken only by the thin sound of a violin in the distant music room still attempting to carry on. "I was taught as a child," she said. "By whom?" She kept her eyes on the floor. "By my adoptive parents, missionaries in the East End." The response drew a stir from the listeners. The ambiguity of it, foreign yet English, servant yet fluent, upended their expectations. She could feel the words sparking behind closed lips, behind fans and crystal goblets. That a maid would speak Japanese in a salon was shocking enough. That she would do so with fluency and unshakable poise was beyond comprehension. Prince Edward's expression didn't waver. He had the bearing of a man taught to maintain dignity in the face of national scandal or foreign betrayal. But something behind his gaze shifted, as though the foundation beneath him had tilted. He stepped closer. "I've never seen you before," he said. "Not in this house." "I don't often enter this room when guests are present," Hana replied. "We're instructed to clean during the quiet hours. And yet tonight, here you are." Her lips pressed together, but she didn't speak. Around them, the crowd had begun to murmur again, nervous and uncertain. The other members of the household staff stood frozen along the edges, their eyes wide, some clutching their trays or polishing rags like shields. The steward of Loxley, a thick-set man in his later years with thinning grey hair and a deep knowledge of noble temperaments, stood just inside the salon's archway, his expression caught somewhere between alarm and indecision. The prince looked at him sharply. "Mr. Byers," Edward said, not raising his voice but drawing attention with the authority of his tone. "Bring Miss Hana to the conservatory. I will speak with her privately." A ripple of stunned silence followed. Mr. Byers hesitated, his mouth slightly open as if he might object, but no words came. Edward's gaze narrowed. "Now." With evident reluctance, the steward stepped forward, gesturing to Hana with a slight tilt of his hand. "This way," he muttered, voice stiff. Hana followed without a word, the cloth still clutched in her fingers, her apron slightly rumpled from kneeling. The path through the room seemed longer than before. Every footstep felt exaggerated, every glance heavy. She did not look behind her, but she could feel Edward's presence following. The conservatory was situated just beyond the south corridor, a glass-walled structure that overlooked the eastern gardens. It had once been the Duchess's favorite room, filled with white camellias and rose vines that coiled toward the curved ceiling. Now, in early spring, only a few blooms had survived the winter chill. The air inside was cool and faintly damp, tinged with the scent of damp earth and iron from the garden tools that lined the outer wall. Mr. Byers opened the door and stood aside, then bowed to the prince before retreating with evident discomfort. Hana stepped through first. The fire in the small hearth at the far end had burned low, giving the room a dim orange hue. Above them, frost clung to the panes of glass like a lace veil. A few stray drops from melting condensation splattered softly onto the stone floor. Prince Edward entered behind her and closed the door. She stood by the nearest potted plant, arms by her sides, the cloth now limp in her hand. She did not speak. The silence between them stretched, a taut line drawn between two people who belonged to separate worlds. Edward walked past her slowly and paused in front of a wide table covered in dried flower cuttings. His gloved hands brushed across the wooden edge, leaving faint streaks in the dust. He turned to face her. "Your accent is not that of a servant," he said, voice quiet and even. "Nor is it of someone who learned a language secondhand." Hannah didn't move. "You speak like a woman who was raised to speak that way, educated, polished." He stepped closer. "And that ambassador, he didn't look at you the way a diplomat looks at a servant girl who happened to say something clever. He bowed to you." She raised her chin a fraction. "Perhaps he was being courteous." Edward studied her carefully. His jaw flexed once, the faintest movement. "No, that wasn't courtesy," he said. "That was recognition." The fire cracked once behind him. The shadows in the room deepened. Hannah's gaze shifted slightly toward the frost-laced windows. Outside, the garden was half swallowed by the darkness. A pair of lanterns flickered in the distance, swinging faintly from the breeze. "I don't know what it is you're hiding," Edward continued, his voice low. "But I can tell you this. I don't believe for a moment that you're simply a maid polishing floors in the Duke's house." Hannah looked back at him, and for the first time since the moment in the salon, her eyes met his fully. There was no fear in them, only quiet resolve. She did not offer an answer. The silence stretched again, heavy with tension. Edward seemed to weigh his next words, his shoulders tight with restraint. He opened his mouth, and then the conservatory door creaked open. Mr. Byers stepped inside, his face pale, his eyes darting uneasily between them. "Your Royal Highness," he said, voice taut with urgency. "You're being summoned. The Japanese ambassador has requested to speak with the maid. At once." Edward's head turned slowly toward him. "With her?" "Yes, sir. Directly. No translator." Hannah's pulse quickened. The steward cleared his throat. He made it clear that the matter could not wait. The prince turned back to Hannah. His eyes lingered on her face for a moment, searching, though for what she couldn't say. Then he stepped forward, and before she could move, his hand closed gently around her wrist. His grip was not tight, but it was firm enough to still her. "You will return," he said, his voice low, nearly a command. "I'm not finished with you." The corridor leading away from the conservatory was lined with gilded sconces, their light flickering against the dark wood paneling as Hannah followed the steward in silence. Her wrist still tingled from the brief touch of the prince's hand, though his fingers had left no mark. Just a lingering warmth that unsettled her more than it should have. The corridor seemed longer than usual, as if the walls were stretching with every step, each moment drawing her farther from the certainty of the world she had known only an hour ago. Mr. Byers moved quickly, but not without stiffness. She could sense his discomfort, the way he looked straight ahead, careful not to meet her eyes. His posture had lost its practiced indifference. In its place was something stiffer, almost anxious. He cleared his throat once, but said nothing. Neither did she. They passed through a discreet door near the base of the east stairwell into a quieter wing of Locksley House, rarely used, reserved for small gatherings or private conversations the household preferred not to advertise. The silence here was deeper. No music reached this far, no laughter, only the soft creak of floorboards and the faint rustle of her skirts brushing against the side of her legs. The floor beneath her was cold stone, a stark contrast to the gleaming parquet she had spent the evening polishing. She expected to be brought to a parlor or side chamber. Instead, they reached a modest drawing room she had cleaned countless times, a space that bore the scent of old papers, dry wood, and fading lavender sachets hidden beneath the furniture. The door was already ajar, the light from inside spilling out in a soft amber glow. Mr. Byers stopped at the threshold. "In there," he said, his voice lower than usual. "He's waiting." Hannah nodded once, stepped inside, and heard the door shut quietly behind her. The room was warm, the fire burning low in the hearth. Heavy curtains had been drawn across the windows, sealing out the night and the wind that moved through the hedgerows outside. A pair of oil lamps glowed on a small writing desk in the corner, beside a tea service set for two. The Japanese ambassador stood near the fireplace, his back straight, his hands clasped lightly in front of him. His interpreter, the same man she had seen earlier in the evening, sat nearby in a chair with a notebook resting on his knee, though he did not write. Both men turned as she entered. The ambassador's expression shifted the moment their eyes met. It softened, not into kindness, but into something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. A memory touched by years and shadow. His eyes, narrow and dark, searched her face with startling focus. He greeted her in Japanese, this time with deliberate gentleness, the language flowing from his mouth like a river long dammed. She bowed low, murmuring a formal reply. The interpreter rose from his seat, bowed and said in English, he would like to speak directly with the young woman. Then he sat again, saying nothing further. Hana stepped forward slowly, careful to observe every nuance of protocol she could remember. Her movements were instinctive, guided more by memory than habit. It had been years since she had spoken this way, moved this way, in the presence of someone who expected it. The ambassador gestured for her to sit across from him near the fire. She obeyed, folding her hands in her lap, her posture straight but not rigid. A pause passed between them. When he spoke again, his words were softer still, though carried an unmistakable weight. You know the language well, he said. Your accent is precise, your manner, unmistakably Japanese. And yet, they say you were raised here. I was, she answered, still in Japanese, by missionaries, in London. The ambassador tilted his head slightly, studying her face. And yet you remember the old customs. You remember how to bow, how to listen. I remembered because I was afraid to forget. At this, he gave a small nod. Approval, perhaps, or understanding. I knew your family, he said after a moment. Before the walls fell, before the treaties came. Your parents were from Totori, a minor house but with strong lineage. Your mother's name was Noriko, your father, Masaki. The names fell like stones into her chest. She had not heard them spoken aloud in over a decade. She had not expected ever to hear them again. She inhaled slowly, trying to still her hands. They sent me away, she whispered. The ambassador's eyes softened. They sent you to live. The world was changing, and not in ways they could protect you from. When the missionaries offered passage, they accepted. Not without pain. But they believed you would be safer in England. Hana's gaze fell to her lap. Your parents died in the years that followed, he continued, along with many others. But there were those who remembered. Those who kept record. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a small lacquered box, wrapped in deep blue silk and tied with a narrow cord of golden thread. The lacquer shone faintly in the firelight, black with painted plum blossoms and a delicate gold seal on the lid. He held it out to her with both hands. This belonged to your mother, he said. She entrusted it to someone close to our family before you were taken from the country. That person delivered it to us in Yokohama only recently, once they learned you were still alive. When I was chosen to represent Japan here, I brought it with me, in case I found you. Hana took the box carefully, her hands trembling as she accepted it. The silk cord was warm from his touch. She stared down at it, unable to speak. You may open it later, he said. Alone. There is a letter, and something more. He leaned back slightly, his voice quieting. There are those in our government who would consider your presence here politically inconvenient. There are others who would see it as a unique opportunity. You must understand what your name, your blood, might represent. Hana raised her eyes. I'm not a political instrument. No, the ambassador said. You're not. He nodded once, slowly. which is why I will not speak your name to the British. I will not use you." A breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding escaped from her chest. "But you must choose," he added. "If you wish to be known by your true name, you need only say the word." She looked down at the box again, its silk cord catching the firelight. "I will wait," he said, rising. "There is no urgency, only time." The interpreter stood as well, his notebook still blank. Hannah rose last. She bowed deeply, and the ambassador returned the gesture, equal and measured. Then he turned and left the room without another word, his interpreter following in silence. She remained for a long moment by the fire, the box still cradled in her arms. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the bare branches against the windows. Somewhere in the main wing of the house, the music had begun again. Life was continuing, as if nothing in the world had changed. And yet everything had. Still holding the box, Hannah stepped out into the corridor once more, walking past the steward without meeting his eyes. The lamps along the hallway flickered gently as she moved past. Her feet carried her by instinct down a flight of narrow stairs, through a quiet passage she had walked hundreds of times. The comfort of routine tried to lull her back into familiarity, but it couldn't erase the weight in her arms. She reached the servants' wing. Her small quarters stood at the far end, tucked beneath the eaves. The room was cold, the window rattling faintly in the wind. She lit her oil lamp with a trembling match and closed the door behind her, locking it for the first time since she'd come to Loxley. She sat at her narrow dressing table, the box before her. For a moment, she did nothing, just breathed. The house beyond the door was quiet. Only the wind moved now, pressing against the glass like a restless memory. Then, slowly, she untied the golden cord. The silk slid away. Her fingers lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in rice paper, was a single folded letter. The paper was yellowed, the ink faint, but the handwriting, curved, elegant, was unmistakably Japanese. And beneath the letter, resting against a velvet lining, was a pendant. She lifted it carefully. A dark oval of lacquer, edged in gold, bearing the chrysanthemum crest of the Tokugawa shogunate. Her mother's name was engraved on the back. A sound came from the hallway outside. Soft, barely audible. A footstep. The floorboard creaked just beyond the threshold, followed by a second, softer step that barely registered beneath the wind pressing against the pane. Hannah turned sharply toward the door, her fingers still wrapped around the lacquered pendant, its edges warm from her touch. The room held its breath with her. The oil lamp flickered, casting long shadows up the wall, turning the narrow space into something unfamiliar. She stood slowly, the pendant slipping from her grasp and swinging against her chest as she moved. Her palm was damp. The letter lay open on the table behind her, its neat characters glowing faintly in the lamplight. She hesitated for a heartbeat, then crossed the room and pressed her ear to the door. Nothing. Only silence. But it was the kind of silence that felt too deliberate, too heavy, as if someone on the other side were waiting just out of sight. Hannah stepped back, letting the lock hold. She glanced once more at the table, the pendant, the letter, the lacquered box. All of it fragile, all of it real. Her life had shifted on its axis, and no one in the house knew it, not the other maids dozing in their rooms, not the butler tallying empty glasses in the scullery, not the Duchess's secretary rearranging calling cards on a silver tray. Only her. And perhaps now, whoever had stopped outside her door. She moved swiftly, slipping the pendant back into the box and folding the letter into a flat square. She pried up the loose floorboard beneath the edge of the cot with careful fingers. It was the same spot where she hid her weekly earnings and the few personal effects she had managed to keep. A photograph of the missionaries who had raised her, a comb missing 2 teeth. She tucked the letter and pendant beneath the plank, settled it back into place, and stood as the floor creaked again. The footsteps had retreated, fainter now, receding into the corridor. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears. She opened the door a fraction and peered into the dim hallway. A lamp at the far end still glowed, its wick turned low. She saw nothing, no figures, no motion. The hush of late night had returned to the servants' wing, the rooms around her still and undisturbed. After a moment, she eased the door closed once more and slipped the bolt into place. She didn't sleep. Instead, she sat by the narrow window, knees drawn to her chest, her breath clouding the cold pane as she watched the darkness shift into a faint gray haze. The sky turned slowly above the rooftops, colors melting from black to slate to a pale, indifferent blue. The morning bell would ring soon, and she would have to rise, as always, to light the hearths and scrub the copper pans. And yet nothing was the same. When the bell finally clanged in the corridor, Hannah was already dressed. Her apron was fastened neatly, and her hair coiled into its usual knot. She wore no expression as she passed the other maids, who mumbled greetings and pulled on stockings with half-closed eyes. The scent of smoke and damp wool clung to the air. Someone laughed in a nearby room, muffled and brief. She descended the back stairwell and retrieved her usual bucket and cloth. Her hands performed their duties without direction, her body returning to rhythm on instinct. But her thoughts drifted, caught in the voice of her mother's letter, in the firm yet quiet tone of the ambassador, in the weight of the pendant still pressed beneath the floorboards like a secret heartbeat. By mid-morning, she was assigned to polish the grand staircase. It curved elegantly through the heart of Locksley House, its banisters lacquered dark as molasses, the wood steps gleaming beneath her rag. She worked from the base upward, pausing at each landing to adjust her grip. Her knees ached faintly. The scent of lemon oil filled her nose. Guests and staff passed occasionally on their way to and from the drawing rooms above, but none gave her more than a fleeting glance. Until she heard footsteps descending, slow and deliberate. She didn't look up at first, but something in the stride, measured, certain, heavier than the footfalls of the housemaids or visitors, caused her hand to falter. She turned her head slightly. Prince Edward. He was alone. His dark coat was buttoned to the throat, a single leather glove tucked beneath his arm. His hair was neatly brushed back, revealing a faint line above his brow where he'd furrowed it too often. His gaze caught hers, and she immediately dropped her eyes, returning to her work. He stopped midway down the stairs, 2 steps above her, so that she faced the polished leather tips of his boots. She said nothing. "I was told you returned to the servants' wing last night," he said. His voice was lower than she remembered, less demanding, almost unreadable. She remained silent. "I spoke with the ambassador after you left," he continued. "He was courteous, but uninformative." Her cloth slowed in her hand. "He said only that your story is yours to tell, that he will not offer it to anyone else." A pause. Then, "Did he give you something?" She did not look up. "I saw the box in his coat," Edward said, his tone quiet. "A woman's box, lacquered, silk-wrapped, Japanese." Still she didn't speak. "I assume it was meant for you." Hannah's hands stilled completely. The silence stretched between them, drawn taut as wire. A servant passed in the hallway below, glanced up at them, and quickly turned away again. Edward shifted. "I don't intend to force answers from you," he said. "But I need you to understand something. The court will hear of this, perhaps already has. Someone saw the ambassador bow to you. They saw you speak to him, fluently. They saw the way I—" He stopped, then exhaled sharply through his nose. "The way I reacted." She rose to her feet slowly, still facing the banister, the cloth limp at her side. "You've drawn attention," he said, "whether you meant to or not. And attention in a room like that is never kind." His words hovered in the air, heavy with something deeper than warning. She finally turned her face toward him, though not fully, just enough that he could see her profile. Her eyes were unreadable, her expression calm. "I know," she said. Edward studied her a moment longer, then inclined his head and descended the final steps. He passed by without another word, and she returned to polishing, the banister catching the morning light like a thread of glass. The rest of the day unfolded without incident, at least none visible. But Hannah could feel the shift beneath the surface of everything, the way glances lingered slightly too long, the way whispered conversations in corners went silent when she passed. It wasn't fear, not yet, but curiosity. And that was almost worse. By the time the sun had lowered behind the hedges and the bell for supper rang through the servants' corridor, she was too tired to feel anything at all. She returned to her room, peeled off her apron, and sat on the edge of the cot. The floor beneath her felt different now, as though it too were aware of the pendant and the letter hidden in its hollow. She didn't touch them, not yet, but the knowledge of them never left her. Even as her eyes closed in exhaustion, her mind raced on. The knock came just after nightfall, a single precise rap on the door. She sat up instantly, her heart leaping to her throat. Then came the sound of paper sliding across wood. She crossed the room in 3 swift steps and opened the door. No one stood outside. Only a sealed envelope on the ground, thick cream-colored stock embossed with a royal crest. Her hands trembled as she reached down and picked it up, her thumb brushing against the red wax. She turned it over. Her name was written in an unfamiliar hand. Inside, the note held a single sentence. She was being summoned to the palace. The envelope sat unopened in Hannah's lap, the wax seal pressed firmly shut, its red surface bearing the royal crest with unmistakable authority. A lion and a unicorn on either side of a shield, a crown poised above as if watching. The air in the room had shifted, charged with something too large to fit inside her narrow quarters. She couldn't quite bring herself to break the seal, not yet. Her hands remained still, her body curled against the edge of the cot, but every part of her felt awake in a way that frightened her. Outside the window, the last light of evening clung to the sky in pale streaks. Dusk crept over the rooftops, soft and cold, and somewhere beyond the hedgerows, bells from a distant chapel rang the hour. 6 tolls. Each one sounded impossibly far away. She stood and crossed to the small table where her oil lamp still burned low. The pendant and letter remained undisturbed beneath the floorboards. She did not need to look at them to feel their presence. As her fingers peeled away the wax and unfolded the heavy paper, she braced herself. The handwriting was precise, elegant, unfamiliar. By order of Her Majesty's Privy Council, you are hereby requested to present yourself at Buckingham Palace before the Crown's appointed advisers. You will be received on the morrow at 10 o'clock in the forenoon. No explanation, no signature beyond the dry bureaucratic flourish beneath the printed language. Under royal seal. Requested. But she knew what it meant. She was not being invited. She was being examined. The rest of the night passed in a strange stillness. The other servants were still gathering in the lower kitchens for supper, but Hannah didn't join them. She stayed in her room, sitting beside the cot, arms wrapped around her knees, the paper clutched tightly in her hand until the ink smudged slightly beneath her thumb. She didn't sleep, not even once. The next morning arrived gray and silent. Mist clung to the edges of the hedges like cotton wool, and the streets beyond Locksley House were still veiled in fog. The carriage arrived before dawn, a simple black coach with no insignia on its side, pulled by 2 dark horses that stood steaming in the cold. The footman who knocked on the servant's door did not announce himself, merely handed a folded note to the steward, and waited. Hannah had been ready since first light. She wore her plainest dress, the only one without fraying cuffs, and a shawl around her shoulders. Her apron she left behind. There would be no pretense of labor where she was going. Her boots were newly scrubbed, though still worn thin at the soles. She said nothing as she stepped into the carriage. The door closed with a soft thud, and the horses moved forward without delay. Through the window she saw the edges of the city blur past, the rows of iron railings, the coal smoke rising from chimneys, the uneven cobblestones that jolted the wheels beneath her feet. Her hands rested in her lap, her fingers wound tightly together. She did not touch the box hidden inside her bag, but she had brought it. The pendant, the letter. If they asked, she would show them. If they didn't, she wouldn't offer. London was still waking as the carriage passed beneath the high stone arches of the palace's side gate. The guards stood motionless at attention, their red coats bright against the grey sky. Hannah caught only glimpses of the great courtyard beyond, before she was led down a quieter drive, through a narrow passage flanked by ivy-covered stone. It was not the grand entrance the public saw, but one used by messengers, servants, or guests of uncertain status. The footman opened the door and offered a hand. She did not take it. Inside, the palace was silent, in a way Locksley never was. The air carried the scent of polished wood and lavender oil, a sharp contrast to the usual salt and coal dust of the city. The floors gleamed like water. Every sconce was lit, but the light was cool, impersonal. A steward met her at the base of a staircase and gestured for her to follow. They passed no other servants, no guests. Just long corridors with portraits of monarchs and battle scenes watching from the walls. Their footsteps echoed with unnatural clarity. Her shoes felt too loud. They stopped before a set of double doors, the panels carved with acanthus leaves. The steward gave a short nod, opened one door, and stepped aside. She entered alone. The chamber beyond was modest by palace standards, square, with a high ceiling and heavy curtains drawn across the tall windows. The walls were lined with shelves holding leather-bound volumes and framed architectural sketches. In the center stood a long table with 6 chairs. 5 of them were occupied. At the head of the table sat a man in a high-collared coat, silver-haired and unsmiling. Beside him, 2 other men in dark suits. To their left, a woman in navy blue, her spectacles perched low on her nose. At the far end, silent and slightly apart, sat Prince Edward. Hannah's gaze caught his for the briefest second before she looked down. No one spoke. The steward who had escorted her retreated quietly, closing the door behind him with a muted click. "Miss Hannah," said the man at the head of the table, "please be seated." Her chair was placed several feet from the end of the table, deliberately distant. She sat slowly, folding her hands in her lap, and waited. The first questions were simple, spoken with the formal tone of a tribunal. Her name, her age, her position at Locksley House, her adoptive family. She answered each clearly without hesitation. Her voice did not waver. When asked whether she had spoken with the Japanese ambassador, she confirmed it. When asked whether she had spoken in Japanese, she said yes. "Where did you learn it?" asked the woman in spectacles, her pen poised above a blank page. "I spoke it as a child," Hannah said. "Before I came to London." "You were born in Japan?" "I don't know exactly where I was born, but yes, I was taken from there when I was very young." "And your parents?" "I don't know their full names, only that they sent me with missionaries. The man who raised me was Reverend George Lennox. His wife's name was Clara." More writing, more silence. At last, the silver-haired man leaned forward, folding his hands. "We understand you were given something last night. A personal item from the ambassador. What was it?" Hannah felt the room close in, the air thickening at her throat. Her gaze drifted briefly toward Edward, but he gave no sign, no encouragement, only stillness. She reached slowly into the bag at her side and withdrew the lacquered box, its silk cord carefully tied again. She placed it on the table in front of her without opening it. "A letter," she said, "and a pendant." The woman took the box and untied it with clinical precision. She unfolded the letter, scanned its contents, then passed it wordlessly to the man beside her. The pendant she held longer, turning it over, inspecting the crest. "The chrysanthemum seal," murmured one of the men. "Not quite," the woman corrected. Tokugawa, pre-restoration. The family line held influence but not current power. Still, the silver-haired man regarded it with a thoughtful expression. Proof of origin, he said quietly. He turned to Hana again. Are you aware, Miss Hana, that certain members of the Japanese delegation believe you to be of noble descent? I was told, she said carefully, that my parents may have belonged to a lesser house. I have no claim. Nevertheless, he said, you are of interest to both sides, and as a subject residing under the crown, your role must be clearly defined. Her throat tightened. You are not a threat, he continued, but you may be viewed as an asset. If used poorly, a pawn. I'm not willing to be either, she said. No, said the woman, glancing at her notes, but that doesn't mean others won't try. The room fell quiet again. Then Edward stood. She should be given time, he said. She has not sought attention, and she has not made demands. She should not be treated as if she had. His voice was calm, but beneath it there was tension, leashed but unmistakable. The silver-haired man's gaze narrowed. This is no longer just a matter of curiosity, Your Highness. The ambassador has confirmed her lineage. She now carries political relevance, whether she welcomes it or not. She's a person, Edward replied. Not a treaty. No one spoke for several seconds. Then, quietly, the man at the head of the table said, She will remain at the palace until further notice. We must ensure her safety and her discretion. Hana rose to her feet. I haven't agreed. It is not a request, he said. She froze. The door opened behind her. A maid in palace livery stood waiting, her hands folded. Please escort Miss Hana to her guest quarters, the silver-haired man said. The maid inclined her head. This way, miss. Hana glanced once more at Edward. He met her eyes with something that might have been regret. She turned away and followed the maid out of the chamber, her footsteps echoing down the long corridor like a drumbeat. She did not see the figure waiting at the end of the hall, half-shadowed behind the marble pillar. The corridor stretched before her, lined with pale marble and tall casement windows veiled by gauzy white curtains. Hana followed the palace maid in silence, her soft-soled shoes barely audible on the polished floor. The weight of the tribunal still pressed against her chest, tight, persistent, like the stiff collar of a dress worn too long. Her hands remained clasped, but her fingers had gone cold, and a faint ache had begun at the base of her skull. The palace felt unreal, too grand, too quiet. Even the scent of it, lavender and waxed wood, seemed distant, like it belonged to someone else's memory. Each step she took along the endless corridor widened the distance between herself and everything familiar, the servants' staircase at Locksley, the scullery's stone walls, the loose board beneath her cot. The maid ahead of her said nothing. She moved efficiently, not cold, but without affection, like someone used to escorting strangers with uncertain titles. Hana doubted the girl knew why she had been summoned, or perhaps she did. Perhaps everyone inside the palace already knew more than she herself did. They turned down a narrower passage, its carpet thick and blue with a floral border, and past two closed doors with brass numbers too polished to bear fingerprints. Finally, the maid stopped and opened a door at the end of the hall. She stepped aside, gesturing inward with a neutral expression. Your room, she said. If you need anything, ring the bell by the hearth. Meals will be brought. You are not to leave this floor unless summoned. Hana's heart sank a little further, though her face gave nothing away. She nodded once and stepped inside. The door closed softly behind her. The chamber was small for a palace, but still finer than anything she had known. A fire crackled in the hearth, its warmth welcome after the cool hallways. The bed was draped in embroidered linens, with an ivory coverlet folded at the foot. A writing desk stood near the window, and beside it, a low table with a silver tea service already set. The curtains were drawn back just enough to show a hazy view of the city beyond, chimneys, slate rooftops, and the spires of distant churches softened by fog. She stood still for a moment, the hush of the room closing in around her. Then, slowly, She removed her bag and placed it on the desk. Her fingers hovered over the clasp. She didn't open it. Not yet. She crossed to the window and looked down. A stone terrace stretched just below, lined with potted evergreens and trimmed hedges. Beyond that, nothing but air and pale sky. No sign of the people who had questioned her, or of Edward, whose presence in that room had left an imprint she couldn't seem to shake. She had imagined, foolishly, that he might speak to her afterward, or at least linger. But he had remained seated as she'd been led away, silent as the others, unreadable. Her fingers curled against the windowsill. The fire snapped behind her. She turned and sat slowly on the small upholstered bench near the hearth, her shoulders tight with exhaustion. The warmth seeped gradually into her bones. She allowed herself a single moment to breathe, to feel the tension slide from her spine and pool at her feet. And then, without knowing quite why, she stood again and crossed to the bag on the desk. She opened it. The lacquered box remained intact, the silk cord still knotted. She unwrapped it carefully, as she had done once before, and lifted the pendant from its velvet nest. It rested against her palm, heavier than it looked. The gold crest glinted faintly in the firelight. Her mother's name, her own. She traced the characters with the pad of her thumb. Then, slowly, she unclasped the chain and looped it around her neck. The pendant lay cool and flat against her skin, hidden beneath the collar of her dress. She turned to the mirror above the washstand and studied her reflection. She looked unchanged, but everything had changed. The hours passed slowly. Midday brought a light meal, delivered by a different maid who barely spoke before retreating again. Hannah forced herself to eat bread, poached eggs, a slice of blood orange, but each bite tasted like paper. She sat by the hearth afterward, knees drawn up beneath her skirts, and tried to read one of the books left on the small shelf above the desk, a collection of essays in French. She understood it, but couldn't concentrate. At dusk, the fire was stoked again by a footman who offered no more than a curt nod. The shadows lengthened. Outside, the city's lights began to flicker on, dotting the streets with orange and gold. The mist thickened. A horse-drawn carriage passed below her window, its wheels clicking softly on the cobblestones. She turned from the window and resumed pacing. It wasn't fear that gripped her now. It was helplessness, an unfamiliar, suffocating feeling that pressed at her chest like a closing fist. Her world had narrowed to a single room in a palace she hadn't asked to enter, surrounded by strangers who spoke in measured tones and used words like relevance and discretion and security. She was beginning to feel like an object placed on a high shelf, labeled and studied. The pendant rose and fell with her breath. A knock came at the door. She startled. This time, it was not the same maid. The woman who entered wore a richer blue uniform, trimmed in silver, her cap neat and starched. She inclined her head politely. "His Royal Highness asks that you join him for tea." Hannah's stomach dropped. "Now?" she asked. "Yes, miss." There was no time to change, even if she'd had another dress. She smoothed the skirt she wore, ran her fingers along the braid at her crown, and followed the maid out of the room. They walked a short distance through the corridor, this one carpeted in deeper red. The sconces flickered with steady gaslight. No other footsteps joined theirs. Finally, they stopped before a tall oak door with an ornate brass handle. The maid knocked once, then opened it. Prince Edward stood near the hearth inside, facing the fire. The room was smaller than she expected, lined with books and maps, and a single long-case clock that ticked softly in the corner. The windows were shuttered. A low table had been set with tea, scones, and fruit preserves, though neither had been touched. He turned when she entered. His coat had been removed, his shirt sleeves rolled to the forearms in a way that seemed both formal and strangely intimate. He looked tired, but focused, as if he had spent the day preparing for this exact moment. "Thank you," he said to the maid, who curtsied and withdrew. Silence followed as the door shut. He gestured toward the small settee beside the table. "Please." She sat, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. He remained standing, watching her. "You're safe here," he said, "but that doesn't mean you're free." She said nothing. "I didn't want this," he continued. "I didn't summon you to the palace. I learned of it only after the decision was made." Her eyes lifted to meet his. "But now that you're here," he said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. "Why have you chosen silence? You've had every chance to speak plainly, about the ambassador, about your history, even about the letter. You've given only what they've asked, nothing more." She held his gaze. "Because I don't owe them more." He nodded slowly. "No, perhaps not. But you owe yourself something. Truth, clarity." He stepped closer. "I can help you, Hannah. I want to help you, but I need to know if you're willing to trust me." The fire crackled, her breath caught in her throat. Before she could answer, a knock sounded at the door, harder this time, sharper. Edward's eyes darkened as he turned. Another knock, followed by a voice muffled through the wood. "Your Highness, the Foreign Office has arrived. They're demanding immediate audience." Edward's expression changed, the composure slipping just enough to reveal what lay beneath. He looked at Hannah with quiet urgency. "You have to leave this room now," he said. "Come with me." Hannah rose before she fully understood what she was doing, her heart thudding as Edward opened a narrow door set into the far wall, half hidden behind a tapestry. He held it open for her with a single sharp motion of his head, and without asking another question, she stepped through. The air beyond was cool and close, the passage lit only by a single gas lamp affixed to the wall. The stone underfoot was uneven, and the scent of damp mortar lingered in the narrow corridor. Edward followed her in, closing the door behind them. The muffled sound of voices filtered through the walls, angry, clipped, official. Already the Foreign Office was making their demands. "They'll search for you," he said, low and quick as they moved. "They'll ask for you by name." "I haven't done anything wrong," she replied. "No, but you've become inconvenient." His hand brushed lightly against the small of her back, guiding her through the curve of the corridor as they reached a branching hallway. Hannah moved instinctively toward the darker path, trusting her steps even as she questioned each one. "You'll be taken to a safe place outside the city," Edward continued. "They'll assume you've returned to the East Wing. You haven't. There's a carriage waiting at the South Servants' Gate. I've arranged everything." She turned to him, stopping beneath a low stone arch. "Why are you doing this?" He met her eyes in the dim light. "Because if you stay here, you'll be reduced to a symbol, a tool. I've seen how it happens. You could be jeopardizing your position." His mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "They've already started questioning that." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and drew out a folded slip of paper. She took it without speaking. It was unmarked on the outside. Inside, in his handwriting, were instructions, an address, a name, and a single phrase. "You are not a question to be solved. You are an answer waiting to be heard." The stone passage turned again, then sloped downward. The air grew colder, the lamps more infrequent. At last they emerged into a small room paneled in dark oak, filled with cleaning supplies, tools, and the faint scent of coal dust. Another narrow door stood slightly ajar across the room. Edward moved ahead and pushed it open. Wind rushed in immediately, sharp and cold. "This leads behind the kitchen gardens," he said. "The gate is 100 yards straight ahead. The driver's name is Callum. He won't ask questions." Hannah paused in the threshold, the mist of the night swirling past her skirt. For a moment she said nothing. Then, with a glance over her shoulder, she asked quietly, "Will they think I've run?" Edward's voice was calm, but firm. "Yes. And for now, let them." She stepped out into the night. The gardens were damp from recent rain, and her boots sank slightly into the soil as she walked, keeping close to the hedges. The fog had thickened, hanging low over the gravel path. She could see only a few feet ahead. The scent of earth and dying roses filled her senses. Behind her, the door shut quietly, No shouts, no alarms. Only the wind through the hedges and the faint tremble of distant voices swallowed by the mist. When she reached the edge of the garden, a low iron gate stood ajar. Beyond it, a carriage waited in the shadows, lanterns dimmed. A driver sat hunched in the box, gloved hands resting on the reins. He looked toward her but did not speak. "Callum?" she asked. He nodded once. She climbed into the carriage without assistance. The door shut with a click, and within seconds, they were moving. The wheels rolled quietly over the gravel, then clattered as they reached the cobbled street. She drew the curtains closed, shutting out the last view of the palace. Her fingers remained curled tightly around the slip of paper Edward had given her. She didn't ask where they were going. The hours passed in near silence. London drifted away, the city growing quieter as they traveled south. The streets grew narrower, lined with old stone walls and thick hedgerows. At one point, they stopped to change horses in a stable yard that smelled of hay and wet leather, but Callum didn't speak even then. She watched him from the window, tall, spare, gray-haired beneath his cap. He moved like a man used to doing difficult things without needing to explain them. She stayed inside the carriage. As dawn approached, the countryside opened before them. Low hills rolled out under a pale sky, and the mist clung to the grass in silver sheets. The road turned onto a long gravel drive flanked by hedges so high she couldn't see beyond them. Then, at the crest of a small hill, the carriage slowed. A house came into view. Not a grand manor, but a large country estate built of weathered stone and ivy-clad walls. Dormer windows peeked out from the upper floor. A wide veranda curved around the front. The gardens had gone a little wild, flower beds left untended, roses sprawling in tangled vines along the balustrades. Hannah stared out, unsure of what to feel. The carriage came to a stop before the house. Callum climbed down and opened the door. She stepped out slowly, her legs stiff from the ride. The morning was cool and damp. Birds stirred in the trees above. Callum gestured toward the house. "Go inside. It's ready for you." She turned toward him, searching for more. But he only tipped his cap and returned to the driver's box. Without waiting for thanks, he guided the horses back down the drive and disappeared into the mist. Hannah stood alone before the house. The front door was unlocked. She stepped inside cautiously. The entrance hall was quiet and dim, the scent of stone and old lavender lingering in the air. A small fire crackled in the hearth of the main room, just enough to take the edge off the chill. The furniture bore sheets of linen, most of them drawn back and folded now. The rooms had been prepared, not recently, but carefully. She could feel the imprint of intention in every corner. She walked through the parlor, touched the curved back of a wooden settee, then paused before the large windows overlooking a garden that had grown unruly with the season. No one was there. The housekeeper, perhaps, would come later. On the low table near the hearth sat a fresh stack of paper and 2 books. Beside them, a small tray of ink and quill pens. A blank canvas waiting. She crossed to the fire and sank into a chair. The pendant lay warm beneath her collar. She reached into her bag and drew out the letter again. Her mother's words. Her own history. There would be time to write, to think, to choose. The hours passed slowly. A midday rain softened the windows. She lit the lamps herself, built the fire again with trembling hands. The silence was not unwelcome, but it was deep and unfamiliar. Just after nightfall, as the last light disappeared from the sky and the hearth glowed low in gold, she heard the sound of footsteps on the front walk. Not cautious, not hesitant, deliberate. She stood slowly, her heart already racing. The knock was firm. 3 sharp taps on the door. The sound of the knock echoed through the quiet house, its rhythm too purposeful to be mistaken for a breeze or the groan of old timber. Hannah stood motionless in front of the parlor fireplace, her hand resting against the mantel, breath suspended. 3 precise knocks, measured, composed, and unmistakably intentional. She didn't move at first. Beyond the windows, The night had deepened into a velvet hush. Rain had passed through earlier, leaving the air damp and cool. The fire behind her crackled faintly, its warmth only barely touching the back of her legs. In that moment, the walls seemed closer than they had before, as though the house itself were listening with her. Another knock, this time softer. A pause followed, long and still. She crossed the foyer with slow, soundless steps, her palm hovering over the latch. When she opened the door, Prince Edward stood on the front step. The mist swirled around him, clinging to his coat. He had no hat, and his dark hair was damp at the temples. His cravat was loose, his gloves nowhere in sight. He looked travel-worn and rain-swept, but his gaze was steady, sharp, with something too potent to name. Hannah stared at him, her fingers still curled around the edge of the door. She had never seen him like this, untethered from his usual restraint, raw from whatever effort had brought him here. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "May I come in?" he asked, his voice rough from the cold. She stepped back without a word. He entered, brushing past her with a gust of damp air, and paused in the middle of the foyer, his eyes sweeping over the walls and the stairwell and the dim lamp left burning on the table near the door. He looked out of place among the quiet domesticity of the house, like a figure sketched in darker ink against a soft watercolor. She closed the door quietly behind him. "I wasn't followed," he said, turning to face her again. "Though I expect they'll realize soon enough that I'm gone." "You left the palace?" "I left a dinner I didn't want to attend and walked out the back entrance before anyone could object. I borrowed a horse from the stables. In this weather," his mouth curved faintly, "I've endured worse." She didn't move from her place near the door. Her fingers had only just stopped trembling. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice quieter than she intended. "They'll come after you if they think you've helped me escape. They already suspect I have." He took a step forward, then another, and stopped just a few paces away. "I didn't come because of them," he added. "I came because I couldn't bear not to know where you were, what they'd done with you, what they might do next." She felt the knot in her throat tighten. His voice wasn't cold now. It held something fierce, something tangled between frustration and care. "I had to be sure you were safe." "I am," she said. He looked at her for a long moment, as if weighing the truth of her words. Then he glanced at the parlor and gestured toward it. "May I?" She nodded. He stepped into the room, moving toward the hearth where the fire had started to fade. She followed at a distance, arms crossed over her waist. He knelt beside the grate and stirred the coals with the iron poker. When the flames revived, casting warmer light over his face, he turned his head toward her. "I know they questioned you," he said, "and I know what they saw when they did." She said nothing. "The pendant. The letter. Your name. They won't let it rest." "I didn't expect them to." He stood slowly. His coat was still damp, the shoulders darkened from the ride. "They're already preparing a diplomatic strategy around you. You won't be told, of course, but the ambassador has acknowledged your family name. The pendant confirms it. That makes you valuable and dangerously visible." Hannah's breath slowed. She stepped closer to the hearth, but not toward him. "What are they planning to do?" "Present you publicly," he said. "Reframe your presence as a gesture of unity. Use your name to formalize the treaty. Elevate you just enough to make it seem like a generous act, while still keeping you under the crown's eye. And what if I refuse? They'll wait, watch, and eventually find another way to make use of you. With or without your consent." The room fell silent again, save for the hiss of the fire. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded packet of papers, bound with a wax seal that had already been broken. "I found these on the Foreign Office desk," he said. "Drafts of the speech they plan to deliver on your behalf. It names you as a cultural liaison, honors your resilience, implies you've returned to your heritage willingly." She reached out and took the pages from his hand. They were heavy, printed on thick vellum. They're writing my history for me. Yes. And if I don't play along? They'll write it anyway. She folded the papers slowly, deliberately, and placed them on the mantel beside the clock. Edward didn't look away from her. The fire threw shadows along his cheekbones, the angle of his jaw, the space just beneath his collar. You could stay here, he said. No one knows this estate. It belonged to my aunt. She left it to the crown in her will, but I'm the only one who ever uses it. They'll find me eventually. Yes, but not yet. Hannah stepped back, her shoulders resting against the wall. The pendant shifted beneath her dress, warming against her skin. She could still feel the imprint of the folded letter in her coat pocket. You gave me a choice, she said. Back in the palace. You told me I didn't have to answer. I meant it. I still don't have the answer. He didn't argue. She looked at him. Truly looked at him. His expression was less guarded now, the distance he usually held so close gone from his eyes. He seemed worn, but not uncertain. You risked everything coming here, she said. I didn't come to be noble, he replied. I came because I couldn't stay away. She turned her face slightly, her gaze dropping to the fire. The heat of it brushed her cheeks, warming places that had gone numb with decision. You don't belong in exile, he said softly. Not when you've done nothing wrong. She gave a small, humorless laugh. I'm not in exile. I've been invisible all my life. This is just the first time someone noticed. His jaw tensed. She stepped away from the wall, her skirt brushing softly across the rug. You said they see me as valuable, but they don't see me. Not truly. I do, he said. Their eyes met again, and the room felt suddenly smaller. The space between them was no longer wide with unfamiliarity, but stretched thin with something heavier, something unspoken, waiting. A knock sounded at the door. The knock echoed gently through the small house, muffled by thick walls and the hush of night beyond the windows. Hannah didn't move at first. Neither did Edward. For a moment, the space between them remained charged, the silence pulsing like a held breath. The fire crackled softly behind him, the warm glow flickering over the bookshelves and the outline of his shoulder. They waited. The knock came again. This time not loud, but deliberate. Whoever stood on the other side wasn't there by accident. Edward turned slightly toward the door, but his gaze lingered on her. Stay here, he said quietly. He walked into the hall, his steps quiet and measured. Hannah followed slowly, her hand resting against the wall as she stopped just short of the threshold. From where she stood, she could see the shadow of the visitor through the frosted pane of glass in the upper part of the door, a tall figure cloaked against the night. Edward opened the door just wide enough to speak. The man at the threshold removed his hat. He was older, dignified, and vaguely familiar, though Hannah couldn't place him. The lines around his eyes were deep, his expression patient. I'm not here on behalf of the Foreign Office, the man said. Edward's posture remained guarded. Then who sent you? No one. I came alone. Miss Hannah's letter reached the embassy yesterday. The ambassador has responded. I was entrusted to deliver his message. Nothing more. He held out a sealed envelope. Edward accepted it without a word. And, the man added, glancing toward the space behind the prince's shoulder, he sends his respects. Their eyes met for a moment, Hannah's and the stranger's, before Edward nodded and closed the door. He turned and handed the envelope to her. Hannah stared down at it, the seal on the front, small and pressed cleanly with the ambassador's personal mark. Her name had been written in Japanese characters, the strokes precise and elegant. She opened it slowly. Inside was a folded sheet of rice paper, light as breath, and written in the same careful hand she had seen before. You have made your choice with grace. You will not be asked to make another. Your name will remain where you placed it, with honor and silence. Let those who seek power do so without you. You are remembered. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the weight of those words settle deep inside. Edward watched her quietly. He said nothing, but something in his expression softened. A flicker of relief, perhaps, or quiet understanding. She folded the letter and tucked it into her sleeve. Neither of them spoke for some time. Later that evening, after the lamps had been lit and supper laid out, simple food, fresh bread, poached chicken, roasted apples, they sat together at the small table beneath the window. The silence between them had changed. It was no longer laced with fear or uncertainty, but with something gentler. The sense of having crossed a line from which there was no need to retreat. Outside, the rain had stopped. The moonlight glimmered faintly on the wet garden stones. Edward reached for the silver teapot and poured her a cup with quiet ceremony, as though it were something sacred. She took it from him without needing to speak. Afterward, they returned to the fire, and Hannah pulled a soft blanket around her shoulders as she took the letter from her sleeve and set it on the small table beside her. The pendant remained at her neck. She hadn't removed it since placing it there. "I keep thinking," she said at last, her voice low, "that when this began, I thought I only wanted to disappear again, to go back to the life I understood." Edward leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Do you still want that?" She looked at him for a long time. "No," she whispered, "but I think I needed to remember who I was before I could decide who I might become." He nodded, watching her.
"You're not a footnote to someone else's history, Hannah. You never were." The warmth that spread through her chest was different this time. Not pride, not certainty, but peace. A quiet anchoring. They spent the rest of the evening reading by the fire, the room dim and calm, their words few. At one point, Edward stood and crossed to the window, gazing out across the lawn. His silhouette was strong, still marked by something restless, but softened now, less guarded.
Hannah watched him, and for the first time in many days, she felt no dread waiting in the corners of the room. Only the promise of stillness, of choice. The next morning dawned with mist again, but lighter now. Pale sun warmed the edges of the garden wall, and birdsong laced the air with something bright and expectant. Hannah dressed without hurry and stepped out into the garden before breakfast. The dew clung to her hem, the air cool but kind against her face. She walked slowly along the stone path, passing wild violets and early spring blooms stretching toward the light. She paused beside a weathered bench, rested her hand on its back, and turned toward the house. Through the tall windows, she could see Edward moving in the parlor, his shirt sleeves rolled again, the light catching the curve of his cheek as he leaned down to tend the fire. Something inside her settled. She had nothing to prove, no mask to wear, no history to rewrite. She returned to the parlor just as he turned. His expression changed as he saw her, a question in his eyes. She answered without words, walking to the desk and picking up the blank sheaf of paper she had left the night before. She brought it to the window seat and unfolded her hands, laying the first page across her lap. "I think it's time I write my story," she said softly. Edward smiled, slow, quiet, and wholly sincere. "Then start with the truth," he said. "All of it." And for the first time, she did. The sun had risen fully by the time Hannah finished the first page. The ink on her fingers had smudged slightly where she'd paused too long in thought, but she didn't mind. She sat curled against the window seat in the parlor, the early light spilling across her lap in soft gold. Outside, the garden glistened from a light morning rain, the stone paths glimmering beneath patches of ivy and tangled violets. Her handwriting had been careful at first, almost too formal. She had started with her name, both names, the one given to her by the missionaries and the one she had been born with. She wrote each with equal weight, refusing to favor one above the other. Then she wrote what little she remembered of her earliest years in Japan. The smell of jasmine steeping, her mother's hands brushing her hair back behind her ears, a lullaby carried in breath rather than melody. The memories came slowly. Some were fractured, some impossibly vivid, all of them real. She didn't write it as a statement or defense. There was nothing to prove. She wrote because the story had waited long enough to be told. Edward sat across the room with a book open on his knee, though he hadn't turned the page in nearly 20 minutes. His gaze shifted between the window and her, quiet but steady. He had not pressed her for more. He didn't ask to read what she had written. He simply stayed. Around them, the house had taken on a lived-in stillness. A fire had been lit in the hearth, more for comfort than necessity. A tray of breakfast sat on the small table between them. Porridge, stewed apples, a slice of bread with marmalade, but neither had touched it yet. When Hannah placed her pen down, she exhaled softly and leaned her head against the glass. Edward spoke only once. "How do you feel?" She looked at him, her eyes still a little wide with thought. Lighter. His smile was small, but there. "I'm not sure what to do with it now," she added. "The story. You don't have to decide that today. But it was never really just mine, was it? They tried to make it theirs. It's yours now," he said simply. "Whatever you choose to do with it next, it's because you chose." That truth settled over her like warmth. Later, they took a walk along the overgrown garden path, their footsteps slow and unhurried. The air was fresh, the rain having swept the dust from the trees. Hannah ran her fingers along the tops of the hedges as they passed, the leaves slick beneath her touch. Edward walked beside her without speaking, their arms close enough to brush now and then, but not quite. When they reached the edge of the grounds, they stood beside the wrought iron gate that opened to a field scattered with tall grass and wild chamomile. A breeze passed through, stirring the hem of her dress, and she closed her eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle in her chest. "I think I could stay here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward turned to her. "You could," he said. "No one would fault you for it. But I don't believe this is the end of your story." She looked up at him. He didn't smile. He didn't soften the words, but there was a gentleness in the way he said them that made her believe them. A respect that was deeper than admiration. They walked back slowly, the garden gate creaking shut behind them. When they returned to the parlor, the fire had dimmed to a faint glow. Hannah added another log and knelt beside it, watching the flames catch. Edward stood behind her for a moment, and when she rose, he took her hand. Not with urgency, not as a demand, but with quiet certainty. Her fingers slid into his as if they had always meant to be there. She looked at their joined hands, then up at him. "I don't know what happens next," she said. "I don't either," he replied. The uncertainty didn't feel frightening anymore. That evening, the house settled into its own rhythm, the walls humming faintly with the echo of rain against the shutters and the creak of old beams in the ceiling. Hannah sat by the fire, the folded letter from the ambassador tucked neatly beside her inkpot. The pendant still rested at her throat, no longer hidden. She turned the final page of her story and placed her pen down once more. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Edward stepped into the room, just as she leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. He crossed to the hearth, his gaze falling on the stack of pages in front of her. "Finished?" he asked. "For now." He sat beside her. The firelight traced the edge of his jaw, softening the lines of his face. He didn't ask to read what she had written. Instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and waited. "I thought," she said, "that when I lost my name, I had lost everything." His eyes met hers. "But I see now," she continued, "that a name is not the whole of a person. I still remember the girl who cleaned the floors at Loxley. I remember the one who stood barefoot in a mission school. I remember the child who listened to her mother speak while the world changed outside the window. And who are you now?" he asked. She looked at the fire, then at him. "Still all of them," she said. "But now I get to decide what comes next." The flames danced in the hearth, casting gold across the room. Outside, the last rain clouds drifted beyond the hills, leaving the night sky clear. And in the quiet house nestled in the English countryside, two people sat together. No longer prince and servant, no longer question and answer, but something quieter and infinitely stronger. Equal, chosen, seen. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.